Now, puberty is that magical time in any young child's life where their body starts changing dramatically. They start smelling really bad, they get kind of moody, and they start thinking about the other people that they've just thought of as friends before in a whole new way. So puberty is generally considered a pretty terrible experience for most people, and it involves this collection of physical changes marking the onset of adolescence. This includes a growth spurt and dramatic changes in the person's breasts or testes. Now, there are going to be huge changes in the person's height and weight, changes in their body fat and muscle content. There's also going to be changes in their reproductive organs, marking the onset of sexual maturity. But we'll talk about that stuff later. There's also going to be a lot of changes in their secondary sex characteristics, but we'll talk about that later too. Now, typically, girls hit puberty first. The average age for a girl to reach puberty is 10 years of age, and for boys, it's 12 years. So, as I mentioned, one of the first things that happens when you reach puberty is that you're going to experience this growth spurt, this dramatic increase in your height and weight. Females will gain as much as 15 pounds a year, and boys will gain 17 pounds. For both boys and girls, their muscle fibers are going to become a lot thicker and denser, and heart and lung capacity are going to increase. And while we do see this in both sexes, we see this a bit more so represented in the boys. Girls, they tend to get a bit more of that body fat. So both boys and girls gain muscle and body fat, but the muscles lean more towards the boys and the body fat leans more towards the girls. So when you look at the data for this adolescent growth spurt, it reflects pretty much exactly what I was describing. You know, growth kind of slows down over the preteen years, and then when you get close to teenage years and you hit puberty, you see a sudden spike in how fast the person is growing in terms of their height and weight. But then that will, over the following years, you know, up to the age of about 20, that will slowly taper off. So most people are done growing by around the age of 18. They're not going to get much taller past the age of 18. And like I said, that's the same case for both boys and girls. Girls usually do peak sooner, but then they stop growing taller sooner as well. So just like how girls hit puberty first, they also go through this growth spurt first. And that difference is once again about 2 years. Now, besides just growing taller and growing fatter, you also see a lot of changes in your brain growth. By the time you've reached adolescence, most children have a brain that's nearly full size. It's not fully done developing yet, but it's basically full size. All those synaptic connections are basically there. The brain has become about as efficient as it can possibly be. You know, all the myelination of axons and the neural rewiring, all that stuff is basically finished at this point. The limbic system, the part of your brain that has to do with pleasure, reward, emotion, desire, that part of your brain is basically fully mature. But there is one part of the brain, one very important part of the brain, that is not yet fully mature and will not be fully mature until mid-20s approximately. And that's the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is very important because this is what we need when it comes to understanding the consequences of our actions, planning for the future, considering moral issues, and other kinds of high-level, cognitive skills. So this part of your brain is still developing in these teenage years. And the consequence of this is that teens tend to not really have those skills as well as they probably should. Teenagers are just more prone to doing stupid things, risky things, things that any rational adult would recognize as not worth it. We can see the consequences of our actions much better than the teens can, And we understand that these courses of action are probably not going to work out in the long run. But, from the teenage perspective, they'll say things like, you only live once, and they'll act without really thinking about it. So this difference in maturity between the limbic system, the pleasure and emotions and reward, the difference in the limbic system and the frontal lobe can be pretty dramatic. So as I said, the limbic system is basically fully developed by the time you reach your teenage years. At about 15 years of age, it has finished developing. But the frontal lobe, that's not fully developed until about mid-20s, like I said, so the age of 25. And the difference in development between these two systems is at its largest between the ages of 10 to 15. So it's in those ages, it's in that age range of 10 to 15 where you see people have these full, complete, intense adult emotions and desires and, feels, but they don't have the adult rationality and critical thinking to be able to handle it. They can't restrain themselves. They can't, make good choices at this point. So this time period between the age of about 10 to 15, this is when kids do a lot of pretty stupid stuff. They just want something really badly, and they're feeling those really intense adult feelings, but they just can't handle it. They can't manage those emotions yet. But something I mentioned at the beginning of this video is that when you reach puberty, one of the biggest changes that occurs is changes in your sexual characteristics, your reproductive capabilities. I often say that, for this reason, puberty is the end of fun for any child, because now they're not going to be spending their days just thinking about what kind of games they want to play and what kind of fun things they want to do. Now their mind is going to be obsessed with the subject of sex. That's pretty typical once you do reach sexual maturation. And you can tell a child has reached sexual maturation because there's certain changes that occur in their primary and secondary sex characteristics. The primary characteristics are those physical signs of maturity related to reproduction itself. So if it's required to make a baby, that's a primary characteristic. Secondary characteristics are things that we see develop at the same time, and they differentiate boys and girls, but they have nothing to do with reproduction. So physical signs of maturity not directly related to the reproductive organs. So some secondary sexual characteristics would be things like facial hair and tone of voice, muscle mass, breast size, so on. Like all these kinds of things that develop at this point. But when it comes to the primary characteristics, there is a clear way to tell when a child is experiencing this. For young girls, what they experience is called menarche, the onset of menstruation. And this typically occurs at around the age of 13. So menarche, when the young girl starts menstruating, that literally means she is becoming reproductively capable. She can have a baby at this point. Now, I'm not saying she should have a baby. Girls that are that young, it's definitely not a good idea for a lot of reasons to have a baby at that point, but they are physiologically capable of doing so. So, typically occurs at the age of 13. Now, it can occur earlier in countries or socioeconomic status levels where nutrition and healthcare are better. So if you come from a better area, if you have better access to nutrition and things like that, then you're just going to probably experience it a little bit sooner. Another factor that can make it occur sooner is if this young girl is heavily stressed. So, like for example, if the girl's mother harshly punishes them, or if they have stressful relationships, then it could lead to early onset of menstruation. It could lead to early menarche. But those early menstrual cycles, when the girl first hits menarche, those early menstrual cycles are going to be pretty irregular. They're going to be hard to predict, and they can vary in intensity. But most people are already familiar with the concept of menarche. I'm sure this is not news to you. But there is a male equivalent to this that most people have never heard of. It's called spermarche, the first spontaneous ejaculation of sperm-containing fluid. So just like how menarche signifies the, reproductive capabilities of the female, spermarche signifies the reproductive capabilities of a male. So a male could, uh, you know, be reproductively successful. They could make a baby at this point, but once again, it's not a good idea. Not only is it illegal in most of the world to engage in any kind of sexual intercourse at this point, but it's yeah. Please don't ever think that I'm advocating that you should do something like this, but I'm just saying when the young boy has his first spontaneous ejaculation, that means he is physiologically capable of making a baby. And this typically occurs at the same age as girls, so the age of 13. But just like girls, this sexual maturation can occur earlier if they come from a higher socioeconomic status. But the stress thing, how stress can lead to early onset for girls, that doesn't really seem to have as big of an effect here. And just in general, socioeconomic status doesn't seem to have as big of an effect either. And just like the girls, the first few ejaculations are also pretty irregular. They contain relatively few sperm cells. Now, sexual maturation and just maturation in general is driven largely by the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is deep inside your brain, in like the core area of your brain, and it releases something that we just call the growth hormone, which regulates all these changes that occur. Not only does it trigger your body to grow larger and denser muscles and so on, but it also stimulates your gonads to start producing a lot of those sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. Young boys see a huge acceleration in the testosterone production, whereas girls get more estrogen. Now, I mentioned a few things that can lead to an early onset of menarche or spermarche, early onset of sexual maturation, those environmental factors. But puberty itself, the beginning of all these changes, that is actually based on your genetics. So some people are genetically predisposed to hit puberty sooner than others. But as I always say, genetics is not destiny. Genetics is just probability. So if you inherit these probabilities to have an early experience of puberty, it's not a guarantee. The environment has to be there to trigger these changes. Now, when we look at the subjective experience of these boys and girls, we tend to see certain patterns. Like when it comes to body image issues, for example. So young girls, they tend to be pretty critical about all these changes that are occurring. They're pretty critical of their appearance and how their body is changing, and they have clear ideas about what kind of changes they want to see. And a lot of these ideas and a lot of this dissatisfaction that results from, not meeting these ideas comes from friends. So friends and just, paying attention to pop culture, they put these ideas in the young girl's head about what she should look like when she reaches sexual maturity, and if she falls short of that, then it's going to be very upsetting. Young boys don't really have this issue so much. Boys are generally pretty happy with the changes that occur during puberty and sexual maturation. The only reason a young boy would be dissatisfied is if he has this personal idea, he has this personal belief of what he should look like when he grows up, and he's just falling short of that personal kind of goal. Like for a lot of young boys, they really strongly desire growing a beard. But beards are not as easy to grow for everyone. Obviously, I don't have any problem with that, but for some men, it is a big issue, and it can be rather frustrating for them. Or maybe they just desire greater muscle mass, and they're just not able to develop that muscle mass as easily as they thought they would. But the point is, boys typically, it's a personal thing. It's not like a social thing. They don't get any kind of dissatisfaction from friends or anything like that. That's more of the female side of this. Now, just like how most people know about menarche, that onset of menstruation, and they don't know a lot about spermarche, well, that's actually because for most of history, when you look at all the cultures around the world, you generally see that when girls become sexually mature, it turns into a celebration. You know, girls usually share this news with their mothers first, but then other people, like friends and family. And in those more traditional societies that we still have today, it does turn into a big celebration. I'm sure you've heard of things like quinceañera and Sweet 16. These are just a couple of examples, but you see what I mean. Like the whole point of these celebrations is to welcome this young girl into womanhood. And there's a lot of reasons why we have these celebrations in the first place, but that's more of a discussion of culture and history, so I don't want to go off on too big of a tangent. For young boys, though, when young boys reach sexual maturation, you generally don't talk about it. Like, maybe they'll talk to their dad, or maybe they'll talk to a brother, but generally young boys are pretty embarrassed by it because, as I mentioned, spermarche involves a spontaneous ejaculation. So that just means, for no apparent reason, they basically wet their pants, to put it nicely. And that is pretty, distressing, especially if the young boy doesn't understand what's going on. So the best thing you could do for a young boy is to just explain to them, maybe by giving them information or just talking to them beforehand, explain to them what's going to happen and why it's going to happen when they reach sexual maturation, when they go through these changes in puberty. But yeah, we just generally don't talk about it. We don't celebrate it. That's just how our culture tends to be. Now, just to wrap this up, one common thing that we associate with all these changes that are going on, these dramatic changes in the person's body and mind, is moodiness. We often have this idea that teenagers are these emotional creatures that just kind of fly off at the smallest provocation. And most people attribute this to rapid increases in their hormones. They do experience rapid increases in their sex hormones. But this is actually not related. Those hormones, those are for sex. It's not for moodiness. The moodiness is more so a result of just all this sudden stress and all these new responsibilities that they have to deal with. Teenagers have to deal with a lot of frequent changes in how they go about their daily life, like these dramatic changes in their social life and their personal life, and now they have all these new ideas about sex and friendship and so on. So it can be pretty distressing in general for the typical teen.